Live from the Plutopia News Network, this is the Plutopia Happy Hour. Our guest tonight is Nik Koetting. The Not Ready for Cable News players are here. I'm Scoop Sweeney. That guy over there somewhere is John Lebkowski, and driving the magic bus tonight is Susie Sheeler.
Hey everyone, how's everyone doing today?
All right.
Nik, thanks so much for coming and hanging out with us. I think this should be fun. I always love your takes on political stuff, other stuff as well, but mostly I think you and I really enjoy history and politics on the same level. But I think you know more about it than I do.
I'm not sure
So Nik, you've been a perpetual student for life so far. I think you're going to continue to do that. You travel a lot still, right? You still go over to Europe when you can.
Not since the pandemic, but I'm really waiting for the next great opportunity to come up.
God, me too. And I'm not going to serve in the military for Ukraine to do it. Unfortunately, I just don't think I can. But that, do you think that they'll be in the EU? Do you think they'll let the Ukraine in the EU?
Well, that's one of the areas that makes it so difficult. Is the entire situation here is because Vladimir Putin has been trying to keep Ukraine from coming into the EU. And this has been a steady process of first Ukraine being allowed to leave, most famously the fact that it's no longer the Ukraine and is now considered an autonomous country. And in 1996, when they famously planted sunflowers over a former missile base, with Russia and the US military in attendance to celebrate this newfound unity. But we've lately been seeing Russia want to reassert its dominance in Eastern Europe through a variety of theaters. And they are using an ethnic civil war as a pretext for all-out invasion.
You're saying that Russia was trying to reassert its dominance. Is it Russia? Or is it more Putin that's trying to reassert his dominance?
Well, as we've seen from recent events, we should definitely always be willing to disassociate the Russian people from the Russian leadership. But it should also be noted that politically, Putin and Russia at this point are very much synonymous. The parliament does basically what he says. So from a political standpoint, I would say Putin and Russia are speaking the same voice, but you are definitely right, is we should always separate the soldiers from the generals.
Do you think there is someone like a Mark Milley who's there, who's telling, his people, listen, we're not going to launch a nuclear war, or is there no one there?
From what I've been able to read on the subject, it sounds like many of Putin's highest intelligence officers and military officers is afraid of Putin at this point and worried that he has gotten unstable. However, I am not sure that they have the political will to make such a challenge. Putin has managed to maintain through either methods of fear or propaganda a high popularity among the Russian people, and he is known and very much embraces the idea of being a strong man. So he definitely rules through a combination of fear and persuasion, which would make many of his top advisors maybe question wanting to make a stand. We all famously know what happens to people who disagree with Putin.
Dating back to the Stalin era, the whole idea of bringing in puppets to take over the infrastructure, that was a popular way of controlling countries. Is you get rid of the legitimate leaders and you bring in your own little puppets, as they would call them. And that seems to be continuing into Ukraine. Even there are already reports that they're trying to kidnap local leaders and bring in their own people to take over.
Yes, we should look to previous examples of where client states have told even strongmen like Stalin and stood up to them. Definitely Marshal Tito in Yugoslavia would be a great example of countering the puppet narrative. But you are definitely right. That is what Russia's plan in Ukraine seems to be right now, is to put in people who will agree 100% One of the things we are really seeing is, well, we're definitely seeing disinformation in the West that is making it hard to get an accurate idea of what's going on. But definitely in Russia, we are seeing people who cannot even discern fact from fiction. We are finding that captured soldiers from Russia were convinced that the Ukrainian government was a Nazi regime.
Yeah, and my understanding is that some of those soldiers thought they were there to rescue people from the Nazis and were shocked at what they found. And there was one story, I don't know whether this is mythical or not, but there was a thing about the Russian soldier who was calling his mom from Ukraine. He had been captured and telling her, he was alive and okay in the Ukraine and he had been captured. And she wouldn't believe him. She said, well, I mean, if they captured you, they would have killed you. You can't be telling me the truth,
Yes, that was a corroborated story. And one of the problems is they were completely sold this, you're not even allowed to call this a war in Russia. It is a military operation. And Vladimir Putin's original reasoning was twofold, which shows a kind of scary combination of what he was thinking, which is that he was initially only coming in to be a peacekeeper for the ethnic Russians in the eastern regions of Donetsk and okay, I'm sorry, I'm blanking. I'm very bad at pronouncing Ukrainian, but the eastern regions was supposed to be the limit of his scope, but everyone knew from the very beginning that, at least in Ukraine, that he was planning on attacking the entire country, especially when he gave a reasoning at 5 a.m. Russian time that Ukraine had been part of Russian destiny from the very beginning and was historically and culturally part of Russia, which leads into the same justification we've seen by many dictators before, most famously, of course, Hitler marching into the Sudetenland based on the idea of Lebensraum and rescuing German peoples who were oppressed by other ethnic groups.
Yeah, the best explanation I heard about him not just limiting it to the eastern areas that no one had ever known a Russian who would only drink a half a bottle of vodka.
Yes, I think that's a good metaphor. But he was obviously setting his sights even beyond the disputed territories he was claiming when he cited Kiev as a ancestral Russian territory. And of course, historically, the Kievan Rus were much different than the Muscovites that eventually became modern Russia and the modern Russian Empire. But ethnically and culturally, we see two major differences between the majority of Ukrainians and Russians, which is linguistically, where they have a very similar language, and religiously, where most Ukrainians come from a Roman Catholic background versus a Eastern Orthodox background. These are often two of the biggest dividing lines in ethnic distinction used to justify wars in countries throughout Central and Eastern Europe.
Wow. I didn't know that. I didn't know. Wow. That's I mean, obviously the German, I mean, I know that one, but I didn't realize this ran along ethnic lines necessarily. I thought it was more a crazy old man who wanted to get to make his legacy, like Lenin-esque and go down in history. I mean, there's a million reasons why that is one that I did not know, but I'm wondering, Putin
I would
was.
like to, sorry,
Go
I'd like
ahead.
to
No.
add to that is not necessarily the actual reality on the ground. This is definitely a modern political war, but Putin is using old ethnic arguments to try to justify his intervention, claiming, again, that Eastern Orthodox Russians in the East are being oppressed by Catholic Ukrainians. And Ukraine is kind of always been a crossroads of several different cultures. It's got a very high Polish population, a high ethnic German population. Many other of the Southern Slavs have also made Ukraine their home. And of course, it has, when you have all of these different ethnicities, it creates a much different culture than in a much more homogenized Slavic country like Russia. So you will naturally often see either disagreements or harmonies. But one of the most interesting things as to why I don't think you can call this as much of the ethnic war that Vladimir Putin wants to make it out is I was recently reading, I believe, in the New York Times that Eastern Orthodox priests in Ukraine are no longer acknowledging the Patriarch of Russia as their in their prayers.
Wow. They put some sanctions on them.
You know, I have a question about, I kind of don't understand what the timing of this thing is. It kind of doesn't make sense to me that when Putin had basically a friend in the White House, that he didn't do something like this then, that kind of out of the blue here in the middle of the Biden administration, that he's decided to take this action. I mean, he had to know that it would be a lot harder to do now than it might have been, you know, a couple of years ago.
There are several reasons that I can see for that. The first of which is, of course, COVID-19 put a lot of plans on halt. In fact, I read that a lot of sources in Russia are saying that since Putin has isolated himself for 2 years, it has affected his mental health. And he is now much more paranoid than he was before going into COVID lockdown. There's also, of course, the reports that the Chinese government asked Putin to wait on any invasion until after the Olympics had to be considered. But I think Vladimir Putin, just from watching the interviews translated as they were, seems pretty obvious that Putin thought he could manipulate Trump in other ways at the time. And I think he knows that he cannot get the same manipulation with the current leadership, so he's trying a different strategy. But one thing that I do think needs to be noted is I feel there's one other world leader that's vacancy has definitely emboldened Putin, which is Angela Merkel has long been known as a foe of Putin and the politician who will most stand up. I think the change in leadership to the current chancellor has convinced Putin that they will be softer than Angela Merkel was, especially in EU response, which fortunately we are seeing that the EU is not being soft on Putin's invasion, both economically and in their willingness to aid Ukrainian refugees.
So Schultz is softer toward
I think
Russians?
Putin perceived him as being softer since he came from the center-left political party instead of the conservative political party. But it's mostly just that I think Putin has had a lot of experience and knows Angela Merkel was such a tough politician that he was willing to take a chance on Schultz.
You would think the Russians would have learned from the dire lesson they had in Afghanistan. That was a military exercise that really went off the rails, and apparently they figured it could never happen to us again, but it seemed like it might.
Well, there's an old saying, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does move in circles. But you could make the same argument about lots of other people. Invading Russia has never been a good idea, but it's not stopped Napoleon from doing it. It's not stopped others from doing it. It's really hard to fight a war in a country that doesn't want you to be there. But the lessons from Afghanistan for both the Russians and ourselves is, of course, that you can easily conquer a country, but holding on to it is the hard part. I think that's what we're seeing with Ukraine is Vladimir Putin thought he could win the hearts and minds of the Ukrainian people because they had been so much aligned with Russia as early as 30 years ago, whereas that is definitely not the case.
I just thought I'd throw up an image of this clock because it seems to be ticking right now.
Yeah.
There's real concern about World War III and the use of nuclear weapons, and I'm wondering how likely that really is.
Unfortunately, I will be the first to say I hope it is not likely, but this is the closest we've been to it since 1989. And I do see that when you have not just Putin as a world leader, but certain people in the West trying to grandstand with a nuclear arsenal and claim things, we could be on our way to that hopefully very terribly and unlikely eventuality, but we should never discount that or keep it off the table, or not keep it off the table like we would ever do it, but keep the knowledge that that event could happen off the table.
Yeah, I wondered strategically how that would go. It seems to me that Putin would be unlikely to just throw a bunch of nukes at well, the U.S. or any other nation, but that it would be more like some strategic blast somewhere to more to make a point than to, you know, be broadly destructive. But I just wonder if, I mean, that's assuming that he's sane and strategic. And it appears he might not be.
Well, I think even using a tactical nuke, like you suggested, would show that he is not fully sane. But that's definitely the more likely scenario that he would do, is trying to make a point that he will be known as the strongest tyrant in Russia and he will do whatever it takes. I think that's a distinct possibility if he feels his hold slipping. But the best method for dealing with him, especially as he is a nuclear powered, or he's a nuclear power and he has shown that he wants to be aggressive, is again, keep the sanctions going on the oligarchs who keep him in power. I think that's a lot of what's created his paranoia, is he feels like he's losing his grip on the oligarchs with the economic sanctions we've had going previously. It's the oligarchs are probably much more interested in money than they are in political power.
Yeah, the nuclear disaster that frightens me more is the whole thing that's been playing out around the nuclear reactors in Ukraine that are under Russian control, and they've been playing fast and loose. You know, shelling a nuclear power plant is not any kind of wisdom that I'm aware of, and it just seems like having them control that, makes it, that's almost like dropping a nuclear warhead. If you start a meltdown at one of those facilities, we all remember Chernobyl, and you don't want another Chernobyl that's in the same neighborhood.
That's a worrying thing too, is also that creates the plausibility of deniability when you claim that, oh, it was an accident that happened, but it ends up destroying with a destructive radius that goes into Poland or other Western neighbors. But I think Putin, the biggest safeguard we have to actual nuclear war is, I think that Vladimir Putin has been so emboldened by how successful he's been by playing the Western powers against each other for the last 5 years. Brexit and the Trump administration, much of the rhetoric we've seen coming from them, all stem back to ideas of destabilizing confidence in Western democracy and the European Union and NATO.
I kind of feel, excuse me, is like this whole Ukraine war is being used as a diversion, is kind of how I feel about it. And so we don't recognize what's happening with their alliance with China and not pay attention to them. I mean, they've destabilized. We are a country divided, if nothing else. And I mean, we can't even wear masks for each other. And so this would be a great time,
Oh, and that's definitely been part of the plan, to destabilize confidence in Western powers by making us all just unable to agree on even simple, reasonable things. But yes, and one other thing to look at is, over the last 5 years, after every one of our diplomatic failures, China has been the one to come in right there and go to whatever country we've had a diplomatic disagreement with and try to renegotiate a more advantageous deal with them. China is investing very heavily in the third world right now and is trying to make new alliances for trade with the European Union that prioritize China over us. And I would think, honestly, one of our number one goals right now as a country is to rebuild the strained diplomatic alliances we have had.
Yeah, Russia was famous or infamous for that same kind of behavior back in the USSR period. They would go in and try to destabilize countries that may have fallen out of favor with the Western countries or were having some political unrest. So, we remember, Cuba and a lot of South American countries that had serious interruptions, thanks to the Russians.
The Middle East is another great example of that. The USSR supplied many Middle Eastern countries with weapons and military guidance in the name of fighting our attempts at diplomacy there.
What
But,
what do you think the grand purpose? I mean, what is his end goal? Does he take everything that was ever? I mean, I heard something about Alaska today. He wants Alaska back. I mean, I don't know if this is some kind of insane just rambling from this man or if he's serious.
Honestly, I cannot tell you what his end goal was. I would have thought at one point it was to economically get the sanctions lifted and get the West to ease back on its attempts to get Ukraine as a Western ally. I have not heard anything about the Alaska thing, but that's a very interesting question. But I don't think so, because no time in any of Russia's expansionism have they ever wanted Alaska back.
He's just got a crush on Sarah Palin. That's all.
I think he does.
I've been to
Yeah.
Alaska, and I can't imagine anyone lusting after Alaska.
I guess it's oil, right? It's got to be the oil.
Well, yes, but Russia is the largest country in the world, and I'm not sure next thing they need is more frozen land.
They've just
Well, I thought his goal was to rebuild the former Soviet Union, to kind of restore that empire.
I would disagree with that, and I think you need to look for another metaphor with that. Is the fact that Putin has no interest in returning to the communist way of life or the communist philosophy. I think a better metaphor would be restore the Russian Empire to its former greatness. And one of the clues that's always made me suspicious of him is when he started using the patronym again, something that had gone out of favor in Russia, but he refers to himself as Vladimir Vasilyevich Putin. So that was typically associated with being a member of the classes with status in Imperial Russia, and it quickly fell out of favor in communist USSR when it was replaced with new lingo such as comrade, and the emphasis that coming from a good family where you recognize your father was seen as classist. So I think
Romanov, was it the Romanovs who were still doing that, or?
Yes, the Romanovs would be the last imperial power, though more through name than actual bloodline. But the Romanovs, I mean, they were still maintaining all of the class structures. There was an attempt for reforms in the first Russian Revolution of 1905, but it was too little too late. And a lot of Russia's problems came from a failure to modernize their country in time, but a lot of them also came from just being blissfully ignorant of what was going on in the streets of St. Petersburg.
The people who have been in charge of Russia, USSR, Soviet Union, all of those things have all been fucking crazy and dictators. With the
Not all of them. Don't you think Khrushchev was adorable?
Well, I was going to say, actually, with the possible exception of, say, Yeltsin or Gorbachev, who I think were just, but they also were key in Putin's rise, were they not?
Well, I think also the fact that where there was a steady power vacuum was also key in Putin's rise. But it's always been, in my opinion, under very mysterious circumstances that one day Boris Yeltsin just announced that Putin was his hand-picked successor, and they were politically very different. But the Russia of the 1990s, there was a huge power vacuum, and to a large degree, it's still a kleptocracy, but Putin was seen as somebody who could return order and take control back from the Russian mafia. Now, the fact that the Russian mafia had the same origins as a lot of his strongmen is a convenient, that's interesting to look at, but a lot of people were hoping that Vladimir Putin would be a reformer that would make things better, and including people in America. There are some famous quotes from people like George W. Bush, who completely underestimated Putin. And I believe he said, "I looked into his eyes." But
How did he get involved with all the oligarchs, the ultra rich folks who were way better off than he was? How did he get that power structure together? It's an interesting symbiosis they have going there.
well, that leads to one other question, which is obviously, I think a lot of it was working hand in hand with the oligarchs that he was claiming that he would reform a lot of the systems. Most of these oligarchs got rich by being able to seize the resources when there was a power vacuum. And there's a great question of the fact that not even the CIA can tell us how much Vladimir Putin is worth. So, I mean, there's no question he's also one of these oligarchs at this point. But it's definitely a marriage of convenience. I think a lot of times the wealthy will take on a strong man in an attempt to see if he will support their status and quo. And to a large degree, he has, with the exception of the economic turmoils of the last 6 years as we tried to fight Russia's expansionism economically, which with a brief gap of about 4 years, he has really supported the interests of the ultra wealthy, and Russia's quality of life is far below that of Western Europe. That's one of the reasons why Ukraine sees aligning themselves with Western Europe as being much more in their favor than aligning themselves with the Eastern, the return of the Eastern Bloc that Putin is kind of envisioning, with taking back the central states as client states.
Well, the Russian economy is in free fall now. How will that affect the oligarchs? Could that perhaps make them think, well, maybe we need another guy driving this bus?
Unfortunately, I've been wrong on some of the economics on this before. I thought they would have acted sooner, but I think the oligarchs, I mean, they will have no choice to act. I mean, when their money is worth nothing and they have no access to their resources, and when your main symbol of status is your yacht that you can leave to go leave Russia and go to the Mediterranean, I think that they will see a return to the status quo as much preferable to trying to save face in this war. I think they probably will be, if not encouraging revolt against Vladimir Putin, they might be really suggesting that he look for a dignified way out of this. Now, all bets are off on how this will go down, because I would have thought they would encourage him to not attack Ukraine before. But there's also the fact that I think a lot of people, even in Russia, were surprised that the attack came when it did.
Perhaps they could all chip in and buy him a really nice mega yacht and send him off to the Pacific somewhere.
I was thinking a horse and a shirt, maybe, but
Oh my Lord.
So what does this mean? Okay, so they frozen all the Russian money is frozen. Its rubles are dust. That's nothing. How does that affect the Trumps? I mean, they've been very clear that
They're
all
going to
of
go broke. He can't pay them.
the funding he
He's been
says he
broke
gets
for a while.
is right. Well, but he says they get they get all their funding from Russia. So I'm wondering how that's going to translate, because they don't need our banks.
well, the fact that Deutsche Bank has always been their intermediary means that he's not getting funding directly from Russia, and if he were, rubles would not be valuable. But there's also the fact that there's still so much we don't know, and so much that's classified as to how much people know about Trump's funding. We know He's had some shady business dealings in Moscow, but we don't know the full extent of them. And there's no question, though, even if it economically hurts Donald Trump, that will not be the last we hear of Donald Trump. I mean, he's managed to turn the entire alt-right movement here into a money-making scheme. I'm sure he'll be able to squeeze lots of that for a continuous time to come.
I wonder how Putin, if Putin will even want him in, if Putin's still around. I can't understand why they're doing this so viciously. They're not making any friends. They're not encouraging anyone to stand up for them. Why would you do this so callously, knowing there are children in a building, knowing it's a maternity ward? Why? Is it just evil?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure what he stands to gain or what Russia stands to gain at this point, except that maybe they feel that they've run out of options and want to try something new. However, there is the fact that they are still having mouthpieces even in America. The Russian government recently, it was uncovered, considers Tucker Carlson to be a asset for them and encourages people in Russia to keep listening to Tucker Carlson. So that tells you that there are definitely people who are still willing to back up Vladimir Putin's plans, including Donald Trump calling it brilliant the day before the invasion.
Yeah. He's really had a hard time trying to figure out how to backpedal from that one. But I have assumed that part of the reason that this has been so persistent and vicious, and that they're doing everything they can to make this campaign in the Ukraine work and take the Ukraine, is because they're concerned about what's on the other side of the Ukraine, and they're concerned about those NATO countries. I mean, Putin seems to be very paranoid about NATO, that at some point NATO will come after him, and it's like he wants that country there, Ukraine, as a barrier between Russia and, I mean, he doesn't want to have, I think his fear was that the Ukraine was going to join NATO, and then he'd have another NATO country on his doorstep.
That was the initial source of this. Was 7 years ago, the Ukrainian people rejected a leader who was much more pro Russia and did not want ties with the West. Their current political inclination was to join NATO when Russia seized Crimea, which put a lot of those plans on a back burner. But more importantly, I think, is NATO is definitely an important part of this, and to the extent that you're even seeing neutral countries like Finland and Sweden start to rethink their positions on NATO. But definitely the stability of joining the EU. This has been at a time when confidence in the EU was kind of at its all-time low, with Brexit and other separatist movements gaining traction. The fact that many countries still coveted the EU status spoke a lot about the value of being in the EU.
It's interesting that the Ukrainians, well, I mean, Zelensky's just an interesting character. He was a comedian. He was the voice of Paddington Bear in the Ukraine, and basically an entertainer. And I guess you never would have suspected that someone with that background would be so effective and actually powerful in the role of what is president? Is it president?
Yes.
Yeah, president of Ukraine. I mean, he's made a really great president for them, and I tend to think that if it wasn't for him and his backbone, I think that they might have folded, with a lesser person in there. But I don't really know very much about, how he came to be president of the Ukraine. Do you know much about that?
Yes, a lot of it had to do with civil unrest in the streets and people protesting and demanding a new election, and they ousted their old government. And he came into power fairly recently on the long-term scheme, but he ran on the idea of building ties with the West and opposing the Russian expansionism. He has long shown that he can be a tough guy. He refused to acquiesce when Russia was paying for mercenaries to go into the disputed territories in Crimea, and was saying that they will never give them up. But he's definitely, in my opinion, proof that comedians may make better leaders than B-movie actors.
You know, Bruce Sterling was telling me that there's a strong tradition of political corruption in the Ukraine. Is he someone who was trying to put an end to corruption? I mean, he's not a corrupt politician, right?
I find it very hard to believe that he's a corrupt politician the way he's acting, but I am not exactly sure. I think some countries' corruption just kind of goes with the territory, but I've noticed that no matter which side of you're on, even if you're part of the corruption, you'll always claim that you're coming in there to end the corruption. But
Drain the swamp.
Well, I'd rather have a comedian than a reality show host. We've learned from that one.
Yeah, Jon Stewart for president.
yes, well, I think Stephen Colbert pointed out on his show the other day that he had run for president twice, but this guy was the real deal.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I will say, though, that it's not just Zelensky's leadership. I mean, I think that bolstered his willingness to stay is the fact that so many people in Ukraine went out into the streets to fight for their country. That the people who stood up to that Russian battleship on, was it called Snake Island, were a inspiration. And the old lady who walked up to the Russian soldiers and gave them kernels of sunflower seed and said, "Keep these in your pocket so that they'll grow when you lay there." There's definitely a lot of people who are not taking this invasion lightly. And I think that's something we have to remember about any country, though, is when you're attacking someone's homeland, they will fight back. We've had to learn this lesson ourselves a lot of times.
Yeah, I think they expected this to be a 2-day war or something like that. And what are we, 4 weeks now?
Yes, I think they started in late February. So that's yes, that's part of the problem Vladimir Putin is currently facing. Is he literally thought this would be over and done with before anyone knew what was going on. So I think that's one of the reasons we're seeing, even by Russian standards, kind of insane rhetoric banning the use of the word war, things of that nature. Even by Russian standards, those are kind of strict, and I think that's because he does not know how to handle the fact that this war stalled. Even when they invaded Afghanistan, they were in Kabul before now.
Yeah, he seems to be in full Trump end of presidency denial. Donald Trump is doing the same kind of thing, bizarre, outrageous comments just because he didn't really expect to not be the president again. And I think Putin was surprised that the people of Ukraine actually stood up to him.
I think the bizarre comments on Donald Trump's part, though, were because he knew he would not be president. What we're seeing from the January 6th committee is documents proving that he knew he had lost. He knew it was false, and he knew he did not have a chance of winning. But he figured if he could keep a false narrative up, then his base would believe him. And that's the same thing we're seeing with Putin, is he believes as long as he can keep this false narrative going, he will still have the support of the Russian people. But I think, and I would never thought I would say this, but I think when you can't get a Big Mac in Russia, that might do a lot to affect your popularity.
That's a truth. That's a truth. There's, I heard that Papa John's is still operating there.
I think they said that they are officially no longer operating, but since most of their franchises are owned by Russians, they are still de facto over.
Maybe the My Pillow guy will go in and do a Russian outlet there. He'd be perfect for that kind of thing.
Well, you were talking about Tucker Carlson, and it just, I feel like I've said this before. I feel like we're just a bunch of individualists at this point. We don't care about our neighbor or our country person or, whatever. We don't care about our country. We care about us, not you, my rights, my rights, my rights. And I feel like that's what's happening. That's what's happening here. Some people are actually do you know anyone who's going over there from the United States to fight? Does anyone know any of the guys who are actually saying, I'll go fight?
No, I was suggesting that they send Trump over there to fight. He's been saying that he could do so much better over there. Just give him a rifle and put him in the streets in Kyiv.
Well, so Tucker was all about saying that, why would I be mad at Putin? What did he ever do to me? Has he ever called me a racist? Has he ever told me that I had to wear a mask to go in a store? You know how he does that thing. And I don't, that's again, back to an individualist populist kind of a thing. And I mean, and is that why they like him there? That seems still like, how can you call yourself American and hope for freedom when you say shit like that? We must have lost Nick.
Oh, where'd he go?
Nick disappeared.
Well,
Tucker Carlson got him.
Oh God, no! Maybe that was his kryptonite. You say that word, and it's
the Tucker Carlson effect. You say the magic word, and you don't get $50.
I can't imagine why Tucker Carlson's show is the most watched news show apparently anywhere. I mean,
well, yeah, I don't know either. It's just so bizarre. I mean, what happened to this country? We used to hate Russia, everything Russian we hate.
Well, but they were communists, and now they're like oligarchs. They're
capitalist
wealthy,
communists.
basically capitalists.
Yeah,
and
the whole communism thing is kind of a red herring, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
It was really Stalinism that was the evil thing, because if you talk to people that are espouse pure communism, that wasn't pure communism was going on. It was Joseph Stalin and his crazy regime.
Yeah, and
it's all about the money.
Mm-hmm.
One way or another.
It seems like all the
and communism, communism takes, theoretically, is supposed to like have a leveling effect and rob from the rich and give to the poor and that sort of thing. That's that. In practice, that's not really the way it was. But and power, I said money. It should be money and power.
Yeah.
And money and power kind of go together. And right
but not
now,
always. So sometimes power, depends. I mean, you get pulled over by a cop and you're a millionaire. He's still got the jump on you.
I don't know about that. Cops may give a millionaire a pass.
I mean, I'm just saying that the power is more important than how much money you got. He's got,
probably
he's
so.
still in charge.
Well, I mean, so right now we have a whole lot of people with a whole lot of money, and tons more people without much money. And the people who have a whole lot of money don't really want to share it with the tons that don't have much. And the sense is that communists, if you look at what communism was at least supposed to be,
here
they were going to facilitate that sharing, right?
Yeah.
And the same thing about liberals. We hate liberals because liberals believe that the money should be leveled out, that there should be more economic equality. And if you have $20 billion, you don't really want to give up $1 billion of it.
Yeah, Nick, did Tucker Carlson come and mug you?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. That was a horrible thing to say.
I fell victim to the ancient problem of having two different chargers and could not find the right charger. I kept hoping my battery would last until this conversation was over. So I apologize for the technical difficulty, but I guess that shows the first world problems we have when you have two different computers.
Famous last words. This battery will not last.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I always lost.
Well, it's
Listen,
the
this
motto
happens
here.
even on the like big network television programs. In the era of Zoom, they have people who drop off.
Yeah, I
Yep,
much prefer it when your cat walks over the screen instead.
that's fun. That's the best. That's the best.
Or
So,
when you show up as a cat. You remember the thing about the guy who
I'm
was in
not
a
a cat, sir.
business meeting and he was wasn't he a cat?
He
That's
was.
my recollection.
He had had the filter on. Somebody had
Yeah.
turned the filter on, so he had ears and little whiskers.
Well, I was impressed by the
Woken up like that some
walk
nights.
across the screen on Russian TV with the anti-war poster, and I was surprised that she was allowed, to walk out of the building because that's
Well,
a big thing.
that may be one of the bravest people I've ever seen. And I think
Yeah.
the fact that she was so much in the public eye is the only reason she's still alive right now.
That was
But-
incredible.
We also have to remember, though, Vladimir Putin, not meaning to cast aspersions, he does have a very long memory on people who are his enemies. So she might not be long for this world. But what she did was absolutely brave. And we are seeing not just that, but with all of the people being arrested in the streets protesting in St. Petersburg and Moscow,
Yeah.
that this is definitely, there's very much reason in this war to notice the difference between the Russian people and the Russian oligarchs, or even Vladimir Putin himself. Is these people, a large amount of them do not want a war, and a large amount of the military, from what we've been reading, have been surrendering because they do not want to fight this conflict now that they're seeing how barbaric it is.
Yeah.
And the fact that, Putin's taking a page right out of George Orwell with the "do not believe your eyes, believe what I tell you." I mean, this is.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's literally Donald Trump said that at one point, I think. What you're seeing is not what's happening.
Yes, he did literally say that, which if I thought he was smart enough to have read Orwell, I would have thought he was just misattributing the quote.
But no.
He
Every
was
time-
he was the guy that Orwell predicted. He didn't have to know about Orwell to set off in that direction.
Well, bearing in mind when Orwell was writing a lot of this stuff, being a member of the Communist Party himself and seeing a lot of the stuff that was going on with Stalin, I mean, he was alive for the last time we had a major rise in authoritarianism, and he was trying to warn against future rises of authoritarianism because he knew the stakes would be much higher. George Orwell fighting in the Spanish Civil War, we can see a lot of parallels there to what's going on in Ukraine too.
The thing that I'm surprised that they haven't been able to get the news of what's really happening into Russia like they used to be able to. Before the internet, you basically had radio, shortwave radio, especially like Radio Free Europe and those kind of broadcasts, well, which of course were funded by the United States government and other governments. And with the internet, it was easy for them to just cut it off and say, well, you can't hear this. And I'm just wondering if the U.S. is even doing anything like that anymore. The Radio Free Europe is still around, I think, but I don't know if it actually has any listenership. But it got a lot of, people stirred up, in Russia back when they were doing their broadcasts.
That's true, but I'm not sure if that's the best source of propaganda anymore. But I know that the U.S. has really stepped up its efforts on the attempts to counter Vladimir Putin's disinformation campaigns. I have not read full details on any of this stuff because obviously they're not going to tell us everything they're doing. But I think definitely the internet is the new radio of the modern era, and it allows for better communication, but it also is just as guilty of being a tool used to spread disinformation. I mean, it's the same social media sites that Vladimir Putin has blocked in Russia were the same social media sites he used to make sure that we were having all kinds of disinformation spread about our politics. So everything is a double-edged sword. I mean, the Radio Free Europe was a great tool for getting Western information to the East, but it was also a double-edged sword in that nobody could guarantee what was being said on that was absolutely true at the time.
Yeah, it was a lot of propaganda from the U.S. perspective, but when the Soviet Union was beginning to crumble, the CIA was sending agents across the borders with backpacks full of fax machines and modems and computers just so they could get these people the tools of the internet. And from what I have read about that, it was very successful at getting people stirred up for that final push to get rid of the Soviet Union.
Yes, intelligence services play a very large part in making sure that people were heavily informed on that. And I'm sure there are similar efforts now, though obviously we would not know anything declassified about that for years to come. But there is the fact that we've also had a war on our intelligence agencies from the executive in recent years. And there is a lot of fear that if they go too far, it might lead to further reprimanding.
So what do you see happening? Do you see the Ukraine going down eventually?
I mean, by sheer numbers, that would have to be the case. Probably the most encouraging thing is the fact that we saw that we have Russia's almost total military engagement right now, and they're still roadblocked. And now that NATO is bringing weapons into Ukraine to help with that effort, we are going to see a much more fair fight. So I don't know, but by sheer numbers, it would just look that way. But I think diplomatically is going to be the way this goes down at the very end, is when Russia just can't afford it anymore. We're going to see.
If Ukraine does go down, we have to remember that Afghanistan went down, but the Russians had a hard time digesting that little morsel because it came to being a very ugly and costly war for them against the people of Afghanistan, and they finally had to leave. And then, of course, other idiots came in and tried to fight the same thing. And
right, you'd think they'd
So what
learn.
you're saying is we're going to see a bunch of cheesy action movies where Sylvester Stallone goes into Ukraine to fight the Cold War.
Of course,
What side is he going to be on? That's the question.
That's the question. I saw. Did you see that meme about Kyle Rittenhouse saying, "Hey, Kyle, get your mom to drive you to Ukraine"? I would question the same thing. What side would he be on? Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of people who are still backing up the Russian propaganda in America even now.
Oh yeah.
And it's just like a follow the leader kind of thing. But now Trump has said, I mean, because it's mostly a lot of Trump people who are supporting this invasion, or at least supporting Putin, is my take. So
Well, the last I heard about Trump was that
he backpedaled.
Yeah, and the way he did it was he said, "Well, Putin seems to have really changed." It's like, this isn't a Putin I knew and loved.
He's so mercurial. That's what I would say.
The kettle.
Well, one of the biggest problems Donald Trump has is he loves it when someone compliments him, even if he doesn't realize it's a backhanded compliment. So there were a lot of diplomatic deals he thought were absolutely great that got us nothing. But I think probably the biggest way we are seeing Russian support right now is in the much more subtle spreading of memes complaining about gas prices right now. Russia's trying to make us feel like we're as economically suffering as they are. And it really makes me wonder how this country would survive World War II in the days of rationing if we had this level of propaganda.
I found myself wondering though whether I mean I think of all those memes as being sort of like viruses, right? I mean we've always talked about information viruses. Doug Rushkoff famously started referring to viral spread of things, media virus, and a virus triggers antibodies. And I can't help but think, and I see signs of it, that people are sort of becoming more and more resistant to those propaganda campaigns as it becomes more and more obvious kind of what they are. And that obviously there's some people who aren't getting it and may never get it, but some people who before were a little susceptible to it are not as susceptible now. And they're beginning to kind of, it's dawning on them that you know, that they're seeing propaganda and they're not seeing like news.
I would want to be cynical about this and say that until we start teaching critical thinking in schools again, this will continue to happen, except that it seems the people most susceptible to this kind of propaganda or virus, as you'd like to call it, seem to be the people who are using technology they don't fully understand, which means that the slow victor of us all, time, will eventually make it so that we are much more savvy of where we're getting our news because we're much more knowledgeable about it. But again, I think that this requires us to get much better as a nation when it comes to critical thinking skills and making sure that we are teaching them not just at the university level where only an elite few are getting these skills.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the teaching of critical thinking skills. The people that are setting up and designing the educational systems that our children and their children will be inflicted with are people that have very limited thinking skills. You know, listen to some of these school board meetings, but it's hard to say who is the most insane, the school board members or the people yelling at them. It's kind of 50-50, I guess.
Well, we are the victims of the fact that the religious right and other organizations have been actively campaigning for people to, their parishioners, their allies, to run for these school board positions because they realize that change can happen from the bottom up as well as the top down.
Yeah.
The two biggest battlefields we have seen are school boards and the courts, and we are losing both those.
Yeah, I know. And it was a kind of a stealth operation there. And the question is whether now that we're becoming more aware that that's what's going on, whether there can be some kind of countermeasure. But it would take time. I mean, they took years. I think some of this stuff started after Goldwater lost, you know, some of the work that they've been doing to get where they are now. So it may take us a long time. Us, I don't know who us is, though. I mean, I'm not sure where I align. I'm sure where I don't align.
Exactly.
You know, I have a few writer friends who are just hoping against hope that one of their books gets banned because apparently that is a real boost to your sales in certain quarters.
Nice.
I have experienced that in the music business. Musicians were wanting to get their records stickered as obscene because you could be guaranteed a platinum record.
Wow.
When I was a kid, that was how we knew the good music to buy.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Sticker.
I've been seeing these kids on YouTube, and they're buying books by people, celebrities they don't like. For example, Jamie Lynn Spears. And this guy hates her. And so he decides that he is going to burn her book on his stream. And I'm just like, it doesn't matter if you don't like the book. That's
The money
just
still
not,
goes to the author.
and that's not what book burning it represents.
That's cancellation. He's canceling Jamie Lynn Spears.
He canceled
We're
her.
about to be canceled
Exactly.
here.
We're
Culture.
about to be canceled. We're about at the end of our
Nick.
hour.
Thanks for coming on, Nick. Will you come back and hang out with us and talk about other stuff?
Yes, I'd love to discuss more issues. That went by too fast. I'm sorry I had technical glitches.
That's
Don't
okay. It
worry.
was very brief. You got back quickly.
Yeah, and we'll
Thanks
have you
for
back
coming.
for sure. It's been
Yeah,
great.
this has been
Forward
great
to a
talk.
return.
Thank you again.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. See you next week.